The coffee has gone cold in my hands, but I can't seem to move to reheat it. The steam stopped rising from the mug 20 minutes ago, right around the time they started talking about Robert on the evening news. I should turn it off. I should get up, walk to that television, and press the power button. But I'm frozen here in my faded blue armchair, the same one I've had for 15 years now, the one I bought after he was gone, when I could finally choose my own furniture. Tonight, we honor the memory of Robert Harrison, a pillar of our community who dedicated his life to serving others. The anchorwoman's voice is warm, reverent. Behind her, a photograph of Robert fills the screen, that same professional headshot, from when he was principal at Lincoln Elementary. His hair is perfectly combed, his smile practiced and charming. The smile that fooled everyone. My left hand instinctively moves to my right forearm, fingers tracing the faded scar that runs from my wrist to my elbow. 47 years old, that scar. I got it the same week Robert received his first Teacher of the Year award. The irony wasn't lost on me then, and it isn't lost on me now. Mr. Harrison touched countless lives during his 40-year career in education, the reporter continues. He coached Little League for over 2 decades, organized annual charity drives, and mentored struggling students. Today, the city is posthumously honoring him with the Community Service Award. I close my eyes, but that only makes it worse. Behind my eyelids, I can see the gymnasium at Lincoln Elementary, packed with parents and children. Robert stands at the podium, accepting another plaque, another certificate. The audience applauds, and I sit in the back row, long sleeves covering the bruises on my arms, a scarf hiding the finger marks on my neck. I clap too, because that's what's expected. That's what good wives do. The award recognizes individuals who have made extraordinary contributions to their community. The voice on the television drones on. Mr. Harrison's widow was unable to attend tonight's ceremony, but in a statement, she expressed her gratitude for this recognition of her husband's legacy. My widow, they called me that. Margaret Harrison, the grieving widow. If only they knew how I really felt when the doctor called to tell me Robert had died of a heart attack. If only they knew about the moment of pure, shameful relief that washed over me when I heard those words. 72 years old, and for the first time in my adult life, I was free. The camera pans across the crowd gathered in the town hall. I recognize some faces: Mrs. Patterson from the grocery store, the Johnsons from down the street, former colleagues and students. All of them nodding solemnly, probably thinking about what a tragedy it was that such a good man was taken too soon. None of them thinking about me, sitting alone in my apartment, watching the ghost of my tormentor being celebrated. He was the kind of man who would give you the shirt off his back, says Tom Morrison, Robert's former teaching partner. I remember Tom. He came to our barbecues, complimented my potato salad, never noticed how I jumped when Robert spoke to me. Bob Harrison was one of the finest men I've ever known. The finest men. I almost laugh, but the sound that comes out is more like a sob. My coffee mug trembles in my hands. Fine men don't grab their wives by the throat and slam them against kitchen walls. Fine men don't tell their children that mommy is having one of her episodes when she's crying from the pain of broken ribs. Fine men don't spend 40 years systematically destroying another human being while the world cheers them on. But that's not the story they're telling tonight. Tonight, Robert Harrison is a saint, and I'm the grateful widow who couldn't bear to watch her beloved husband being honored. The lie is so perfect, so complete, that sometimes I wonder if I'm the one who's wrong. Sometimes I wonder if the bruises were just accidents, if the fear was just in my head, if the terror that consumed 4 decades of my life was just my imagination running wild. And I touch my scars, and I remember every single one. The camera cuts to footage of Robert coaching Little League. There he is, kneeling down to help a young boy with his batting stance. His face patient and kind. The parents in the background smile and wave. I was there. That day, sitting in the bleachers with the other mothers, pretending my sunglasses were for the bright sun, and not to hide the black eye from 3 nights before. He had such a way with children, says Karen Mills, whose son played on Robert's team. He was tough but fair, and he really cared about those kids. My son still talks about Coach Harrison. Tough but fair. I wonder if Karen would have called him that if she'd seen how he treated his own children. If she'd seen Sarah flinch every time her father raised his voice or watched Michael develop a stutter that lasted for 3 years. If she'd seen the way they learned to disappear into their rooms when Daddy came home from his coaching duties, tired and irritable and looking for someone to take it out on. The segment is winding down now. More testimonials, more praise, more lies dressed up as truth. The mayor speaks about community values and lasting legacies. The camera shows the plaque they've mounted in the town hall. Robert's name etched in gold letters for all eternity. A permanent reminder of a life well lived, a man well loved. I finally find the strength to reach for the remote. My arthritis makes my fingers stiff, but I manage to press the power button. The screen goes black, and suddenly I can see my reflection in the dark glass. An old woman alone in a small apartment, still carrying the weight of secrets that died with their keeper. But I'm alive. Despite everything he did to me, despite the years he stole and the spirit he tried to break, I'm still here. The bruises have faded, but the woman who endured them remains. And maybe that's victory enough. I set down my cold coffee and reach for the phone. Sarah will want to know about the ceremony. She'll want to know that I'm okay, that I survived another public celebration of the man who made our lives hell. And I'll tell her what I always tell her. We're the ones who know the truth, and that has to be enough. The room is quiet now. Just the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic outside. In this silence, I can almost hear the voice I lost so many years ago. The voice that learned to stay quiet, to stay safe. Tonight, it whispers a truth that no ceremony can change. I survived. I am still here. And that is everything. I was 25 when I first realized that the man I married wasn't the man I thought I knew. It was a Tuesday morning in September 1973, and I was standing in our kitchen making Robert's coffee 2 sugars, splash of cream, served in his favorite blue mug. Sarah was 3 then, Michael barely 18 months, and the house smelled like baby powder and the remnants of breakfast. I thought we were happy. I thought we were the perfect American family. Margaret, this coffee tastes like dishwater. Robert's voice cut through the morning quiet like a blade. He stood in the doorway, still in his pajamas, holding the mug I'd so carefully prepared. Can't you do anything, right? I turned from the sink, dish towel in my hands, confused. I made it the same way I always do. Let me don't. His tone was sharp, final. Just don't. I don't have time for your excuses. I have a faculty meeting in an hour, and I need to look professional. Unlike some people, I actually care about my reputation. The words stung more than they should have. I'd been up since 5 that morning with Michael, who was teething and fussing. I'd gotten maybe 3 hours of sleep, but I'd still made sure Robert's shirt was pressed, his breakfast ready, his coffee prepared just the way he liked it. But apparently, I'd failed again. I was always failing at something. I'm sorry, I whispered, already reaching for the coffee pot. I'll make a fresh pot. Forget it. He set the mug down hard on the counter, coffee sloshing over the rim. I'll get something at school. At least the secretary there knows how to make a decent cup of coffee. The comparison hit like a slap. Mrs. Henderson, the school secretary, was everything I wasn't perfectly put together. Never a hair out of place. Always smiling and competent. I caught a glimpse of myself in the kitchen window's reflection. Messy hair, stained robe, exhaustion written across my face. No wonder Robert was disappointed. That evening he came home with flowers. Yellow roses, my favorite, wrapped in brown paper from Murphy's Market. His smile was warm, apologetic, the same smile that had made me fall in love with him in college. "I'm sorry about this morning, sweetheart," he said, pulling me into his arms. "I had a rough night's sleep and I took it out on you. That wasn't fair." I melted into his embrace, breathing in his familiar scent, Old Spice and chalk dust. "It's okay," I murmured against his chest. "I should have been more careful with the coffee." No. He pulled back, cupping my face in his hands. "You're a wonderful wife, Margaret. I don't know what I'd do without you. The boys at school are always going on about their nagging wives, but you're different. You're special." I felt the familiar warmth of his praise, the way it filled the hollow spaces his morning words had carved out. This was the Robert I'd married, kind, thoughtful, loving. The other Robert, the one who'd spoken so coldly about my coffee, must have been a fluke. Everyone had bad mornings. The pattern established itself slowly, so gradually that I didn't notice it happening. There would be criticism my cooking wasn't quite right. The house wasn't clean enough. I'd embarrassed him at a faculty party by telling the wrong story. Then would come the apology, the explanation, the flowers, or the special dinner out. He'd tell me how much he loved me, how lucky he was to have me, how other men envied him his devoted wife. "You're too sensitive," he'd say when I tried to explain. How his words hurt. "I'm just trying to help you be your best self. That's what husbands do, they help their wives improve." And I believed him. I wanted to be better, to be the wife he deserved. When he suggested I stop having lunch with my sister Linda because she fills your head with nonsense, I agreed. When he said my friend Carol was a bad influence, and that I should spend less time with her, I nodded and pulled away. When he started checking the phone bill to see who I'd called during the day, I told myself it was because he cared about our budget. "Margaret, you called your mother 3 times this week," he said one evening, waving the phone bill in front of me. "That's 47 minutes of long distance. Do you know how much that costs?" "I'm sorry," I said automatically. "Mom's been lonely since Dad died. I just wanted to check on her." "Your mother is fine. She's got her church friends, her neighbors. She doesn't need you calling her every day like some worried child." He set the bill down, his voice taking on that patient tone he used with difficult students. "You have responsibilities here, Margaret. To me, to our children. This family should be your priority." I nodded, shame burning in my chest. He was right. I was being selfish, neglecting my duties as a wife and mother. I cut back on the calls, then stopped them altogether except for special occasions. Mum never said anything, but I could hear the hurt in her voice during our brief, infrequent conversations. The isolation crept in like fog, so slowly I didn't realize how alone I'd become until it was too late. Friends stopped calling when I kept making excuses not to meet for coffee. Family visits became rare, then non-existent. My world shrank to the walls of our house, to Robert's schedule, to his needs and preferences. "Look at us," he'd say over dinner, gesturing around our dining room with its polished table and carefully arranged flowers. "We have everything we need right here. Why complicate things with outside interference?" And from the outside, we did look perfect. Robert was rising through the ranks at Lincoln Elementary, beloved by students and parents alike. I was the dutiful, Wife, always impeccably dressed for school functions, always ready with a smile and a casserole for potluck dinners. The children were clean and well behaved, at least in public. We were the family others aspired to be. But at home, the walls were closing in. Robert's criticism became more frequent, more pointed. Nothing I did was quite right. The house was too messy, then too sterile. Dinner was too fancy, then not special enough. I was too talkative at parties, then too quiet. I was gaining weight, losing weight, not taking care of myself, trying to. Odd, other wives understand their role, he'd say, his voice heavy with disappointment. They don't question their husband's judgment. They don't make everything so difficult. I started second-guessing every decision, every word. I'd stand in the grocery store for 20 minutes, paralyzed by the choice between 2 browns of tomato sauce, terrified of picking the wrong one. I'd change my clothes 3 times before school events, never sure if I looked appropriate. I walked on eggshells in my own home, monitoring Robert's moods, adjusting my behavior to match his expectations. The children sensed the tension, even if they couldn't understand it. Sarah became clingy, following me around the house like a shadow. Michael's sunny disposition dimmed, and he started having nightmares. I told myself it was normal childhood phases, that they'd outgrow it. But late at night, when Robert was asleep beside me and the house was quiet, I'd lie awake and wonder when everything had changed. When had I become so small, so careful, so afraid of my own husband's disapproval? When had love started feeling like a test I was constantly failing? I pushed the thoughts away. Robert was a good man, a respected teacher, a pillar of our community. He was just particular. That's all. High standards weren't a bad thing. He was trying to help me be better, stronger, more worthy of the life he'd given me. I had to believe that, because if I didn't, if I let myself think otherwise, I'd have to admit that the man I'd promised to love and honor was slowly, methodically destroying the woman I used to be. And I wasn't ready for that truth. Not yet, the first time Robert hit me. I was 35 years old and folding laundry in our bedroom. It was March 1983, and he'd just come home from a meeting with the school board where he'd been passed over for the assistant principal position. Again, I heard his heavy footsteps on the stairs, the way he slammed the bedroom door behind him, and I knew he was in one of his moods. They gave it to Peterson, he said, loosening his tie with sharp, angry movements. That incompetent fool who can't even manage a parent conference without breaking into a sweat. I looked up from the basket of clean clothes, offering what I hoped was a sympathetic smile. I'm sorry, honey. Maybe next time. Next time? His voice was low, dangerous. There might not be a next time, Margaret. Do you understand that? While you're sitting here playing housewife, my career is falling apart. I set down the shirt I'd been folding, my hands trembling slightly. Robert, you're an excellent teacher. Everyone knows that. The right opportunity will come along. Will it? He turned to face me fully, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before, a cold fury that made my breath catch. Because Peterson's wife actually supports his career. She volunteers at the school. She hosts dinner parties for the board members. She makes an effort. What do you do, Margaret? What do you contribute? The accusation hit me like a physical blow. I'd been volunteering at the children's schools for years, organizing bake sales and helping with field trips. I'd hosted countless faculty barbecues. In our backyard, always making sure Robert looked good in front of his colleagues. But suddenly, under his withering stare, none of that seemed to matter. I do support you, I stammered. I've always supported you. Have you? He stepped closer, and I instinctively took a step back. Because Mrs. Peterson mentioned to me today that you haven't been to a single PTA meeting this year. She said, "You seemed distant at the last faculty gathering. Is that the kind of support you think I need?" "I've been helping Mom with her doctor appointments," I said, my voice getting smaller. "She's been having those dizzy spells and your mother again." He shook his head, disgusted. "Always your mother. When are you going to understand that your first loyalty is to me, Margaret? To this family? To my career?" I opened my mouth to respond, to defend myself, but no words came. He was right, wasn't he? I had been distracted lately, worried about Mum's health, caught up in the children's activities. Maybe I hadn't been paying enough attention to what Robert needed. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I didn't realize." "You never realize." His voice was getting louder now, and I could hear Sarah and Michael moving around downstairs, probably wondering what was happening. "That's the problem, Margaret. You're so wrapped up in your own little world that you don't see what's important. You don't see that I'm fighting for our future every single day while you're off playing nurse to your mother." "That's not fair," I said, and the words were out before I could stop them. "I care about your career. I care about our family. But my mother is sick, Robert. She needs help." The slap came so fast I didn't see it coming. One moment I was standing there trying to explain, and the next I was stumbling backward, my cheek burning, my hand flying up to cover the spot where his palm had connected with my face. We stared at each other in stunned silence. I could feel the heat radiating from my cheek, could taste the metallic tang of blood where my teeth had cut the inside of my mouth. Robert's hand was still raised, his face a mask of shock and fury. "Look what you made me do," he said finally, his voice hollow. "Look what you made me do, Margaret." I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. The rational part of my mind was screaming that this was wrong, that husbands didn't hit their wives, that I should run, should call someone, should do something. But my body was frozen, trapped between disbelief and a terrible growing fear. "I didn't mean to," he continued, running his hands through his hair. "God, Margaret, I didn't mean to. But you push and push until I can't think straight. Why do you do that? Why do you make me lose control?" Tears were streaming down, my face now hot and silent. I touched my cheek gingerly, wincing at the tenderness. "Robert, I don't." He held up a hand, stopping my words. "Don't say anything else. Just ... just don't." He left the room then, left me standing there among the scattered laundry. My world suddenly tilted on its axis. I could hear him downstairs, talking to the children, his voice normal, pleasant, asking about their homework and their day, as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. I locked myself in the bathroom and stared at my reflection in the mirror. My cheek was red and already beginning to swell. There would be a bruise by tomorrow, I realized. How would I explain it? How would I hide it? The questions came in a flood. What would I tell the children? My mother? The neighbors? How long before someone noticed? And underneath all of those practical concerns was a deeper, more terrifying question. What would I do if it happened again? When I finally emerged from the bathroom, Robert was waiting in the hallway. He looked smaller somehow, diminished, his earlier fury replaced by something that looked almost like shame. "Margaret," he said softly, reaching for me. "I'm so sorry. I don't know what came over me. The stress of the job, the disappointment. It's no excuse, I know that. But I would never hurt you on purpose. You know that, don't you? I wanted to pull away, to run, to scream. Instead, I found myself nodding, accepting his embrace, breathing in his familiar scent while my cheek throbbed against his chest. It won't happen again, he whispered into my hair. I promise you, Margaret, it won't happen again. But even as he spoke the words, even as I let myself believe them, I knew something fundamental had changed between us. The fear that had been growing in the shadows for years had finally stepped into the light, and I couldn't pretend it didn't exist anymore. Over the following weeks, Robert was different, gentler, more attentive. He brought me flowers, complimented my cooking, even suggested we take a weekend trip to the coast. The bruise on my cheek faded to yellow, then disappeared entirely, and I began to think maybe it really had been an aberration. Maybe the stress of his job disappointment had pushed him to a breaking point he'd never reach again. I found myself watching him more carefully now, monitoring his moods, his tone, his body language. I started changing my behavior without even realizing it, speaking more softly, agreeing more readily, avoiding topics that might upset him. The children noticed too, I think. Sarah became more withdrawn, spending hours in her room with her books. Michael's cheerful chatter at dinner grew forced, performative. We were all walking on eggshells, and Robert was the only one who seemed unaware of it. Or maybe he was aware. Maybe he liked it. Maybe this was exactly what he'd wanted all along. Family so afraid of his anger that they'd do anything to avoid triggering it. 3 months later, when he didn't get the promotion he'd applied for at the district office, I found myself bracing for another explosion. But this time I was ready. This time I would be more careful, more supportive, more understanding. This time I would be the wife he needed me to be. This time I would make sure it didn't happen again. But as I stood in that same bedroom, folding laundry with shaking hands while Robert's voice grew louder and more frustrated downstairs, I realized, with a sick certainty, that my promises to myself were as empty as his promises to me. The fear had taken root, and it was growing stronger every day. I woke up in the hospital on a Tuesday morning in September 1985, 2 days after what I would later learn was the worst beating of my life. The first thing I noticed was the pain-sharp, stabbing agony that radiated from my left side with every breath. The second thing I noticed was the lie already forming in my mind, as automatic as breathing. I fell down the stairs. The emergency room doctor, Dr. Martinez, was a slight man with kind eyes and gentle hands. He stood beside my bed reviewing my chart, his expression carefully neutral. "Mrs. Harrison, you have 3 broken ribs, a concussion, and some significant bruising. Can you tell me what happened?" "I fell down the stairs," I said, the words coming out hoarse and mechanical. "I was carrying laundry and I tripped. Lost my balance." He nodded, writing something on his clipboard. "The stairs in your house must be quite steep. These injuries are consistent with a significant fall." I knew he didn't believe me. I could see it in the way he avoided my eyes, the careful way he phrased his words. But I couldn't tell him the truth. I couldn't tell him that Robert had grabbed me by the throat and thrown me against the kitchen counter because I'd forgotten to pick up his dry cleaning. I couldn't tell him that when I tried to crawl away, Robert had kicked me in the ribs over and over until I stopped moving. "Yes," I whispered. Very steep stairs. The beating had started over something so trivial I could barely remember what it was. Robert had been having a bad week. Another teacher had been promoted to department head, a position he'd wanted. He'd been tense, irritable, finding fault with everything I did. The dry cleaning was just the final straw. "You had won. Job today, Margaret," he'd said when he found his shirt still hanging in the closet, wrinkled and unwearable. "One simple job, and you couldn't even do that right." "I'm sorry," I'd said, backing toward the kitchen. "I'll go get them right now. The cleaners are still open. Now? I need those shirts now. I have a meeting with the principal in an hour." His voice had that dangerous edge I'd learned to recognize. The one that made my stomach clench with fear. What am I supposed to wear? What am I supposed to tell him when I show up looking like a slob? I tried to explain, tried to apologize, tried to make it right. But there was no making it right. There never was, not anymore. The violence had become a regular part of our lives, as predictable as the weather. A bad day at work meant a bad night at home. A perceived slight meant swift retribution. My existence had become a careful dance around Robert's moods, and I'd stumbled. The nurse who came to check on me was different from the doctor. She was young, maybe mid-20s, with auburn hair and a no-nonsense attitude. She introduced herself as Jennifer and began checking my vitals with efficient movements. "How are you feeling this morning, Mrs. Harrison?" she asked, adjusting my four. "Better," I lied. "Thank you." She nodded, but I caught her looking at the bruises on my arms, the finger marks on my wrists that looked exactly like what they were, evidence of someone grabbing me, holding me down. "Mrs. Harrison," she said quietly, glancing toward the door. "I want you to know that if you ever need to talk to someone, we have resources here. Counselors, social workers, people who can help." My heart began to race. "I don't understand." I fell down the stairs. "I told you. I know what you told me." Her voice was gentle but firm. "And I'm just saying that if you ever need help, there are people who care. There are places you can go." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small card. "This is a hotline number for women who might need support. I'm going to leave it here on your bedside table, just in case." I stared at the card like it was a snake. "I don't need that. I'm fine. My husband is a respected teacher. He would never—" "Of course," Jennifer said quickly. "I'm sure he wouldn't. That the number is there if you ever need it." After she left, I lay in that hospital bed staring at the ceiling, trying not to think about the card on the table beside me. But I couldn't stop myself from reading it over and over. Domestic violence. Hotline. 24 hours. Confidential. Free. Domestic violence. The words felt foreign. Impossible. That was something that happened to other women. Poor women. Uneducated women. Not to me. Not to the wife of a respected teacher. Not to someone who lived in a nice house in a good neighborhood. But as I lay there, cataloguing my injuries, I couldn't deny what had happened. Robert had hurt me. Badly. And this time, there had been something different in his eyes. Something that scared me more than his fists. There had been no remorse, no apology afterward. He'd simply stepped over my crumpled body and gone to get ready for his meeting. The door opened, and Robert walked in carrying a bouquet of pink roses. He was dressed in his best suit, his hair perfectly combed, his expression the picture of concern. "Oh, sweetheart," he said, rushing to my bedside. "I'm so sorry this happened. I should have fixed those stairs years ago. I blame myself entirely." I watched him perform, watched him play the role of the devoted husband. He held my hand gently, careful not to touch the bruises. He spoke to the nurses with just the right amount of worry and gratitude. He was so convincing that I almost believed him myself. "The doctor says you'll be fine," he continued, stroking my hair. "A few weeks of rest, and you'll be good as new. I've already called your mother, told her you had a little accident, but that you're going to be okay." "What did you tell the children?" I asked. "That Mommy fell down the stairs and needs to rest for a while. They understand." He smiled that charming smile that had fooled everyone for years. "Sarah made you a card. She's so worried about you." The thought of my daughter worrying about me, of both my children living with the fear that I'd seen growing in their eyes over the past few years, made my chest tighten with something deeper than physical pain. "Robert," I said quietly. We need to talk about what happened. His hand stilled in my hair. What do you mean? You fell down the stairs, Margaret. It was an accident. No, it wasn't. The words came out stronger than I'd expected. You know, it wasn't. For a moment his mask slipped, and I saw something cold and calculating in his eyes. Then he smiled again, shaking his head sadly. The concussion is affecting your memory, sweetheart. The doctor said that might happen. You're confused right now, but you'll remember correctly once you're feeling better. But I did remember. I remembered every detail with crystal clarity. I remembered the sound of my ribs breaking, the taste of blood in my mouth, the terror of thinking I might actually die this time. I remember everything, I said. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. No, Margaret, you don't. You fell down the stairs. That's what happened. And that's what you're going to tell anyone who asks. Because if you tell any other story, if you try to turn this into something it's not, you'll regret it. We both know how clumsy you can be. How easily accidents happen. The threat was clear, and I felt the familiar fear wash over me. But underneath it, for the first time in years, I felt something else. Anger. Not at myself, but at him. At what he'd done to me, to our children, to the woman I used to be. After he left, I stared at that card on my bedside table for a long time. I thought about Jennifer, about the kindness in her eyes, about the courage it must have taken for her to reach out to me. I thought about Sarah making me a get well card, about Michael's frightened eyes when Robert raised his voice. I thought about the stairs in our house, which were neither steep nor dangerous. I thought about the truth, and how it was being buried under layers of lies and fear. And for the first time in 12 years of marriage, I wondered if maybe, just maybe, there was another way to live that it took me 2 years to find the courage to. Call the number on that card. 2 years of hiding it in the bottom of my jewelry box, underneath the pearls Robert had given me for our wedding. 2 years of taking it out when he was at work, staring at the faded ink, memorizing the numbers, until I could recite them in my sleep. 2 years of planning, dreaming, and finally, on a cold February morning in 1987, dialing. My hands shook as I held the phone to my ear. Sarah was at school, Michael was at his friend's house, and Robert was at a district meeting. I had maybe 2 hours before someone came home. Domestic violence hotline, this is Karen speaking. The voice was warm, patient, and suddenly I couldn't speak. What was I supposed to say? How did you tell a stranger that your husband, the man everyone respected and admired, was slowly killing you? Hello? Is anyone there? Yes, I whispered. I'm here. Take your time. Karen said. You're safe to talk right now? Yes, for now. The words came out in a rush. I don't know why I'm calling. I don't even know if I should be calling. You should, she said firmly. If you're calling, there's a reason. Can you tell me what's been happening? And so I told her. For the first time in 14 years of marriage, I told someone the truth. I told her about the bruises, the broken ribs, the way Robert controlled every aspect of my life. I told her about the fear that had become my constant companion, the way I jumped at sudden noises, the way I trained myself to disappear. I'm so sorry this is happening to you, Karen said when I finished. And I want you to know that none of this is your fault. Do you understand that? None of it. I started crying then, great heaving sobs that I tried to muffle with my hand. No one had ever said that to me before. For so long, I'd believed that if I could just be better, more careful, more understanding, the violence would stop. There are shelters, Karen continued. Safe places where you and your children can go. We can help you make a plan. My children, I said. the words catching in my throat. He's never hit them. Just me. Maybe they're better off, Margaret, Karen interrupted gently. Children who witness domestic violence are being harmed too. They're living in fear, walking on eggshells. They're learning that love looks like violence, that this is normal. You said your daughter is 17. She's going to be in relationships soon. What do you want her to think love looks like? The question hit me like a physical blow. Sarah, my beautiful, brilliant daughter, who'd grown so quiet over the years, who flinched when her father raised his voice, who'd started dating a boy who reminded me uncomfortably of Robert. What do? I asked. First, you need to think about your safety. When would be the safest time to leave? When he's at work? At night? We need to plan this carefully. Over the next few months, Karen and I talked every week, always when Robert was out, always in whispered conversations that I ended the moment I heard a car in the driveway. She helped me understand the cycle of abuse, helped me see the patterns I'd been trapped in for so long. She helped me make a plan. The plan was simple. I would take the children and leave on a Thursday afternoon when Robert was at his monthly district meeting. I would drive to the shelter in the next town where we would be safe while I figured out what to do next. I opened a secret bank account, depositing $20 whenever I could spare it from the grocery money. I gathered important documents, birth certificates, social security cards, my marriage certificate, and hid them in a bag in the back of my closet. But Robert noticed everything. He always had. Margaret, he said one evening in June, looking up from the checkbook he was balancing. There's been some unusual activity in our account. Small withdrawals, nothing major, but consistent. My blood turned to ice. I don't know what you mean. $20 here, $30 there. Always on Thursdays. His voice was deceptively calm. Where's that money going? I scrambled for an explanation. I've been putting a little aside for Christmas shopping. I thought it would be nice to have something saved up. He studied me for a long moment, and I forced myself to meet his eyes, to look innocent and slightly confused. Finally, he nodded. Christmas. Shopping. In June. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. My practical wife, always thinking ahead. That night, I lay awake knowing that he suspected something. I could feel it in the way he watched me, the way he questioned my every move. I should have called Karen, should have accelerated the plan, should have left immediately. Instead, I waited. I told myself I was being paranoid, that Robert couldn't possibly know about the money or the shelter, or the escape plan that had become my lifeline. I was wrong. The beating that followed was unlike anything that had come before. Robert didn't just hit me, he systematically, methodically, tried to break me. He found the bag of documents in my closet, the bank account statements I'd hidden in my jewelry box, the domestic violence hotline card that had started it all. Tid, you really think I wouldn't find out? He asked, standing over me as I lay curled on the bedroom floor. Did you think you could just sneak around behind my back like some common criminal? I couldn't speak. Blood was running from my nose, my lip was split, and I was pretty sure he'd broken my wrist when I tried to block one of his punches. You want to leave me? He kicked me in the stomach, and I doubled over, gasping. You want to take my children? And run away like some pathetic victim? Please, I managed to whisper. Please stop. I'm not done talking. He grabbed me by the hair, forcing me to look at him. You're never going to call that number again. You're never going to make any more plans. You're never going to try to leave me again. Because if you do, Margaret, I will find you. And when I find you, I will kill you. Do you understand me? I nodded, terror making it impossible to speak. And if you think about taking my children, if you even think about turning them against me, I will make you sorry you were ever born. I will make your life so miserable that you'll beg me to end it. He let go of my hair and I collapsed back to the floor. Those are my children too. And no court is going to take them away from an upstanding teacher to give them to a mentally unstable woman who makes up stories about her husband. He was right, and we both knew it. Who would believe me? Who would choose my word over that of Robert Harrison, beloved educator and pillar of the community? I had no job, no income, no family support. I was completely dependent on him for everything. Clean yourself up, he said, straightening his shirt, and get rid of that bank account. Tomorrow. After he left the room, I crawled to the bathroom and looked at myself in the mirror. My reflection was barely recognizable, swollen, bloody, broken. But it was my eyes that scared me the most. They were empty, defeated, the eyes of someone who had finally given up. I closed the bank account the next day, as instructed. I never called Karen again. I threw away the phone number I'd memorized, forced myself to forget it existed. I went back to being the perfect wife, the woman who never complained, never questioned, never dreamed of escape. But something had changed in me that night. The hope that had sustained me through the darkest moments was gone, replaced by a cold certainty that this was my life now, that I would never be free, never be safe, never be anything more than Robert's victim. The children sensed it too. Sarah, now a senior in high school, stopped talking to me about her college plans. Michael, 13 and growing taller every day, started spending more time at friends' houses. They were pulling away, preparing for the day when they could escape. The prison that our home had become. And I didn't blame them. I was no longer the mother who could protect them, the woman who could save them. I was just another casualty of Robert's rage, another broken thing he kept around to remind himself of his power. The worst part wasn't the physical pain. It was the knowledge that I had come so close to freedom, had actually touched it with my fingertips, only to have it ripped away. The failure wasn't just mine. It was my children's too. I had failed them, just as I had failed myself. In the darkness of that realization, I made a promise to myself. I would never try to leave again. I would never give Robert another reason to hurt me like this. I would be the perfect victim, the ideal prisoner, the woman who had finally learned. Her place. It was a promise I kept for the next 16 years. The night Robert received the Outstanding Educator Award. In 1995, I sat in the high school auditorium wearing a long-sleeved navy dress and a carefully applied layer of concealer over the bruises on my collarbone. The auditorium was packed with parents, students, and fellow teachers, all of them on their feet applauding as my husband walked across the stage to accept his plaque. Robert Harrison has dedicated his life to shaping young minds, the superintendent announced into the microphone. His commitment to excellence, his compassion for students, and his tireless community service make him a true role model for educators everywhere. I clapped along with everyone else, my hands moving automatically while my mind drifted to 3 nights earlier. Robert had been grading papers at the kitchen table, frustrated by what he called the declining intelligence of today's youth. When I'd brought him coffee too cold, apparently he'd grabbed my wrist and twisted it until I cried out. The bruises were shaped like fingerprints, purple and ugly against my pale skin. "Margaret, isn't this wonderful?" whispered Helen Foster, the woman sitting next to me. Helen's husband taught 5th grade at Robert's school, and she'd always been friendly to me at faculty events. "You must be so proud." "Yes," I managed, forcing a smile. "Very proud." "You're so lucky to have such a devoted husband," Helen continued. "Bill is always saying how much he admires Robert's dedication. Working late, staying for every school event, coaching the debate team. When does he find time to relax?" If only she knew how Robert relaxed. If only she knew about the way he unwound after those long days of being the perfect teacher, the way he took out his stress on the person who couldn't fight back, who couldn't tell anyone, who had learned to absorb his rage like a sponge. Very committed, I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. After the ceremony, there was a reception in the school cafeteria. Robert held court near the refreshment table, surrounded by colleagues and parents who wanted to congratulate him. I watched him from across the room, saw the way his face lit up when people praised his work, the way he graciously accepted their compliments with just the right amount of humility. Mrs. Harrison, a young woman, approached me, her face bright with enthusiasm. "I'm Jennifer Walsh, Tommy's mother. I just wanted to thank you for supporting your husband's after-school tutoring program." Tommy was failing math, and Mr. Harrison stayed late every Tuesday and Thursday to help him catch up. I nodded, trying to look pleased. Robert had never mentioned Tommy or any tutoring program. Those Tuesday and Thursday evenings, he told me he was in faculty meetings. I'd spent those nights walking on eggshells, making sure dinner was ready. The moment he came home, knowing that any delay would result in criticism, anger, or worse. "Your husband saved my son's academic career," Jennifer continued. "And I know he's done the same for so many other children. You must be incredibly proud to be married to such a caring man." Caring. The word echoed in my mind as I smiled and nodded and accepted her thanks. If Robert was so caring, why did Sarah flinch whenever he raised his voice? Why did Michael spend most of his time at friends' houses, coming home only when absolutely necessary? Why did I lie awake at night, listening for his footsteps, my body tensing with fear? "He's wonderful with children," I heard myself say. "He has such patience." But even as I spoke the words, I remembered the way he'd screamed at Michael 2 weeks ago for spilling juice on the carpet. The way he'd grabbed our 15-year-old son's arms so hard it left marks, calling him clumsy and stupid. The way Michael had looked at me afterward, silently begging me to do something, to say something, to protect him. I'd done nothing. I'd cleaned up the juice and apologized to Robert for not watching Michael more carefully. I'd become complicit in my own son's abuse, and the shame of it ate at me every day. "Margaret, there you are." Robert appeared at my elbow, his arm sliding around my waist in a gesture that looked affectionate, that felt like a warning. "I've been looking for you. I was just talking to Mrs. Walsh," I said carefully, "about Tommy's tutoring." "Ah, yes, Tommy." Robert's smile was warm, genuine. "Bright boy, just needed some extra attention. That's what teaching is all about, meeting each child where they are." Jennifer beamed at him. "You're an inspiration, Mr. Harrison. Tommy talks about you all the time." After she walked away, Robert's grip on my waist tightened. "What did you tell her?" "Nothing," I said quickly. "Just that you're wonderful with children." "Good." His voice was low, meant only for me, because I'd hate for anyone to get the wrong impression about our family. The threat was subtle but clear. Even here, surrounded by people who adored him, Robert was reminding me of my place. I was an extension of him, a reflection of his character. Any crack in my performance, any hint that things weren't perfect at home, would be seen as a betrayal. Later, that evening, we attended a dinner party at the superintendent's house. I sat at the dining room table, picking at my food while conversations flowed around me. The other wives talked about their children, their jobs, their vacation plans. I listened and nodded, contributing just enough to seem normal while inside. I felt like I was drowning. "Margaret is such a treasure," Mrs. Peterson said to the group. "She's been volunteering at the school for years, always supporting Robert's programs. Behind every great man, right?" The women laughed, and I forced myself to join in. Behind every great man was a woman who'd learned to hide her bruises, who'd mastered the art of explaining away her injuries, who'd become so skilled at pretending that sometimes she forgot what was real and what was performance. Robert is lucky to have such a supportive wife, added another woman. So many marriages suffer when one partner becomes too successful. But you two seem stronger than ever. Stronger than ever. If only they knew how strength in our marriage was measured by my ability to endure, to remain silent, to protect Robert's reputation at the cost of my own sanity. We're very happy, I said, the lie sliding off my tongue with practiced ease. On the drive home, Robert was expansive, energized by the evening's praise. Did you see how impressed everyone was with the award? Peterson said I'm being considered for the principal position at the new elementary school. That's wonderful, I said, staring out the passenger window at the dark streets passing by. It is wonderful, he agreed. And I expect you to remember that. Tonight proved how respected I am in this community. How valued my contributions are. People look up to me, Margaret. They see me as a leader, a role model. I understood what he was really saying. If I ever tried to tell anyone the truth about our marriage, who would believe me? Who would take the word of a housewife over that of an award-winning teacher? Who would think that the man they'd applauded tonight was capable of the violence I endured behind closed doors? I understand, I whispered. Good. He reached over and patted my knee, the gesture tender and possessive, because I'd hate for anything to damage what we've built together. This reputation, this respect, it's taken years to cultivate. I won't let anyone destroy it. When we got home, Sarah was waiting in the living room, her college acceptance letter in her hands. She'd been accepted to a university 3 hours away, far enough to escape, but close enough to visit. Congratulations, sweetheart, Robert said, his voice full of pride and warmth. This is wonderful news. Sarah looked at me over his shoulder, her eyes full of questions I couldn't answer. She was 18 now, old enough to understand what she'd witnessed growing up, old enough to know that leaving meant abandoning me to face Robert alone. I can defer for a year, she said carefully. Stay home, maybe get a job. Nonsense, Robert interrupted. You're going to college, just like we always planned. Your mother and I will be fine, won't we, Margaret? I met my daughter's eyes and saw my own fear reflected there. She'd learned to read Robert's moods just as I had, learned to navigate the minefield of his emotions. But she'd also learned something I was still struggling with, that staying to protect someone who couldn't protect themselves was just another form of prison. We'll be fine, I said, giving her the permission she needed to save herself. Your father is right. You should go. That night, as I lay in bed listening to Robert's satisfied snores, I thought about the awards ceremony, about all those people who saw him as a hero. I thought about the respect he'd earned, the reputation he'd built, the community that celebrated him. And I thought about the woman who made it all possible, the woman who absorbed his rage so he could be gentle with his students, who hid her bruises so he could maintain his image, who sacrificed her own well-being so he could be the man everyone believed him to be. The community's blindness wasn't accidental. It was cultivated, carefully maintained by a man who understood. That public perception was more powerful than private truth, and I was both its victim and its enabler, trapped in a performance that would continue until one of us was gone. It was sometime in the fall of 1995 when I realized my children were no longer children. Sarah had just turned 18 and was preparing for her first semester away at university. Michael, at 15, was in that awkward space between boyhood and manhood, growing taller by the day, his voice deepening, his eyes already tired in a way that unsettled me. They had survived Robert's house the way you survive a long winter quietly, carefully, with pockets of frozen emotion buried just beneath the surface. I thought I had protected them. I clung to that thought for years, wrapped it around me, like armor, but the cracks were beginning to show, and once they did, I couldn't unsee them. Sarah came home from school one afternoon with a boy named Darren. He was tall, handsome in a way Robert would have approved of, clean-cut, athletic, polite. But there was something in the way he placed his hand on the small of Sarah's back as she walked through the door that made my stomach twist. It was too firm, too possessive. I watched her flinch ever so slightly, her smile tightening, her shoulders stiffening as he guided her to the living room. I offered them lemonade. He declined for both of them without asking her. I noticed how Sarah didn't correct him. Later that night, I asked her about it gently. "Is he good to you?" I said, trying not to sound accusatory. Sarah rolled her eyes, the way girls her age do when their mothers ask about boys. "He's fine, Mom," she said, but her voice was flat, her gaze avoiding mine. "He's not like Dad." It was meant to reassure me, but it had the opposite effect. If a comparison to Robert was the only bar Sarah was using to measure safety, then she was already in danger. A few weeks later, I overheard Darren yelling at her on the phone. His voice was sharp, angry, accusing her of talking to another boy after class. Sarah was crying, whispering apologies, promising she hadn't done anything wrong. I stood outside her bedroom door, my hand hovering over the knob, paralyzed by the memory of a much younger me whispering those same apologies into our kitchen floor. I didn't go in. I didn't say anything. I told myself it wasn't my place. I told myself she was 18, that she would figure it out. The truth was, I didn't know how to help her without unraveling everything I'd kept buried. Michael was harder to read. He had grown quiet, secretive. He stayed out late, sometimes didn't come home at all. He said he was sleeping over at friends' houses, but when I called their parents, they either hadn't seen him or hesitated too long before answering. His teachers said he was distracted, sometimes hostile. He got into a fight in gym class and was suspended for 3 days. When I asked him what happened, he shrugged and said the other boy was asking for it. I didn't press further. I was afraid of what I might find if I did. One evening, I found a notebook in Michael's backpack. I hadn't gone looking for it. He'd left it open on the kitchen counter. Inside were pages of dark, angry drawings. Broken windows. Fists. A faceless man towering over a cowering child. In one, a stick figure lay curled on the floor, red scribbles surrounding it like blood. My hands shook as I flipped through the pages, each one a silent scream I hadn't heard. When he came downstairs and saw me holding it, his face went pale. "Give it back," he said, his voice low and trembling. I tried to say something too. Ask him if he was okay, if he wanted to talk. But he snatched the notebook from my hands and stormed out the back door, before I could get a word out. I stood in the kitchen alone, the sound of the screen door slamming behind him echoing like a verdict. That night, I lay awake listening for the creak of the stairs, the soft thud of Michael's footsteps returning home. He came back past midnight, his clothes smelling like smoke. I didn't ask where he'd been. I was afraid the answer would be a mirror held up to all my failures. The next morning, he barely looked at me as he grabbed a piece of toast and disappeared into the day. I began to understand then that staying for the children hadn't saved them. It had broken them in ways I was only beginning to see. Sarah had learned to equate control with love. Michael had learned that silence was safer than truth. And I had taught them both how to survive a house ruled by fear, how to fold themselves, small enough to avoid notice, how to disappear inside their own lives. I had believed I was protecting them, but what I had really done was show them how to live with a monster and call it family. One Sunday afternoon, I found Sarah sitting alone, in the backyard, knees tucked under her chin. The sunlight caught the edge of a faint bruise on her forearm, small, round, the shape of a thumb. She noticed me staring and quickly pulled down her sleeve. "It's nothing," she said. I sat beside her, close enough to feel the tension. In her shoulders, far enough not to push her away. "You deserve more than nothing," I said softly. "You deserve someone who makes you feel safe every day. You hear me, Sarah?" She didn't respond right away. Then she nodded, just once. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't even agreement. But it was a crack in the wall between us. That night, after the house was quiet, I sat at the kitchen table and cried. For Sarah. For Michael. For the versions of them that might have existed if I had left when they were little, when the bruises were fresh and the fear hadn't yet calcified into normal. I cried for the family we could have been, and for the mother I had failed to be. But when the tears stopped, something else remained. A clarity. A resolve. I couldn't rewrite the past. But maybe, just maybe, there was still time to change the ending. The flyer came folded inside a grocery bag wedged between a carton of eggs and a box of saltines. I almost threw it out without reading it. But something about the bold purple letters caught my eye. You are not alone. Below it, a list of meeting times, a location just across town, and a quiet promise. Support group for women healing from domestic abuse. Confidential. No judgment. No pressure. I stood at the counter, staring at the paper as the hum of the refrigerator filled the silence behind me. I hadn't said the word abuse aloud since the last time I'd whispered it into a phone years earlier. Even now it felt foreign, like a coat that didn't quite fit, but had been tailored for someone who looked just like me. I didn't go right away. I folded the flyer and placed it behind a jar of flour in the pantry, the way you might store a key you weren't ready to use. But over the next few days, I found myself pulling it out and reading the words again. You are not alone. It was such a simple sentence, but it echoed in me like a bell. For so long, I had lived like I was the only one trapped in a private war, invisible to the outside world, erased even in my own home. It wasn't courage that finally got me through the door of the community center. It was exhaustion. It was the kind of bone-deep weariness that settles in when you've spent too many years pretending not to be hurt. I walked into the building on a Thursday evening just after 7. The chairs were arranged in a circle, the lighting soft, the air tinged with the scent of brewed coffee and faint lemon-scented disinfectant. A woman with cropped grey hair and kind eyes greeted me. "First time?" she asked. I nodded. She didn't ask for my name or my story. She just pointed to a chair. "Wherever you feel comfortable." I sat down, heart pounding, palms damp. The other women looked like anyone you'd pass on the street middle age. Tired, ordinary. One wore a nurse's uniform. Another had a toddler asleep in her lap. They smiled politely, not with pity, but with understanding. The woman leading the group, Elena, began by reminding everyone that no one had to speak. "Sometimes just being here is enough," she said, her voice gentle. "Sometimes listening helps more than talking." I listened. A woman named Tracy talked about how her husband broke her collarbone during their anniversary dinner. Another, Maria, described how she'd been isolated from her sisters for so long, she forgot what it felt like to laugh. A third, Joanne, spoke of the night she packed her 2 children into a car with 1 change of clothes and $32 in her purse. None of their stories were exactly like mine, but the cadence of their voices, the shame, the fear, the guilt was familiar. It was like listening to echoes of my own silence. I didn't speak that first meeting, or the second, but I went back. Every Thursday, I began to look forward to those hours. The small grace of sitting in a room where no one pretended things were okay, when they weren't. Where tears didn't need excuses. where I didn't have to smile when someone mentioned Robert's name. On the 4th week I found my voice. It started as a whisper. "I used to think I was lucky," I said, staring at the floor. Robert never hit the children. Just me. The room was silent still. But I see it now. The bruises were mine, but the damage, it lived in all of us. When I looked up, the women weren't shocked or horrified. They nodded. Some wept. One reached across the space between us and gently touched my hand. That moment cracked something open in me, something that had been locked tight for decades. For the first time, I began to understand that what had happened to me wasn't a reflection of my weakness. It was evidence of how long I'd endured. In the weeks that followed, I started keeping a journal. Just a cheap notebook from the drugstore. But each night, after Robert went to sleep, I would sit at the kitchen table and write. I wrote about the night he broke my wrist, about the silence at Sarah's graduation dinner, about the way Michael still flinched at sudden noises even in his 20s. I wrote about the way Robert used words like weapons, carefully choosing insults sharp enough to wound but vague enough to deny. "You're just tired, Margaret. You're always so emotional." Don't twist my words. I filled pages with memories I had tried to forget. I gave them shape, gave them language. And in doing so, I gave them less power. Elena, the group leader, noticed my change. "There's strength in naming things," she said one evening as we walked to our cars. "Abuse thrives in silence. But once you speak it, once you see it for what it is, it can't control you the same way." I nodded, feeling that truth settle in my chest like a stone and a balm at once. At home, nothing had changed outwardly. Robert was still Robert, still charming at church, still demanding at home. But something in me had shifted. I started saying no, small ones at first. "No, I won't go back and fix your tie again. No, I didn't forget to defrost the meat, you just didn't tell me. No, I'm not stupid, I'm tired. These weren't battles. They weren't defiant declarations. They were quiet boundary lines, drawn not for him, but for me. One evening, he noticed. "You're different lately," he said, narrowing his eyes. "What's going on with you?" I smiled faintly. "Nothing. Just remembering who I was before." He scoffed, but I saw it, the flicker of uncertainty in his expression, the subtle shift in his posture. He couldn't quite name the change, but he could feel it. The power he had always held so effortlessly was no longer complete. That night, I opened my notebook and wrote one line in bold ink. "I'm not the woman I used to be." And he knows it. It would take years before I could act on that truth. But for the first time, I believed I might one day be ready. Not just to leave, but to live. Not just to survive, but to reclaim what was mine. My voice, my name, my story. The fight began over a dress. Of all things. I had been invited to a retirement party for Mrs. Patterson, the same woman who used to greet me at the grocery store with a knowing smile and questions I could never answer truthfully. She was retiring from the school district after 40 years. And her daughters had planned a small celebration at the community center. They'd extended an invitation to Robert and me. I hadn't expected it. We were rarely invited anywhere together these days, but I accepted before thinking it through. When the day arrived, I stood in front of the mirror, holding a navy blue dress to my frame, wondering if it still fit. I hadn't worn it in years. Robert had once told me the color made me look washed out, and I'd banished it to the back of the closet. But that evening I wore it anyway. I hadn't meant to embarrass him. I hadn't even spoken much. At the party, just a few polite words, a smile here and there. But toward the end of the night, someone asked me to say a few words. "You've known her for years, Margaret," said one of Mrs. Patterson's daughters, handing me a microphone. "You probably have the best stories. I hesitated, then took the mic. My voice was shaky at first, but I found my footing. I talked about the afternoons Mrs. Patterson used to slip Sarah peppermints at the store, about the way she once gave me a pie recipe that turned out to be a family secret. People laughed. Someone clapped. I smiled. I felt if only for a moment visible. Robert didn't say anything until we got home. The drive was quiet. Too quiet. I should have known. I should have read the silence for what it was. A gathering. Storm. As soon as we walked through the front door, he closed it with more force than necessary. "What the hell was that?" he said, his voice low and tight. I turned to face him, still holding my purse. What was what? The little speech, the dress, the flirting with every man who looked your way. I wasn't flirting. I kept my voice steady, refusing to backpedal. I was being polite. And that speech? They asked me to speak, Robert. It wasn't about you. He stepped closer, and I could smell the bourbon on his breath. Everything is about me when you're standing next to me. You think you can play the star now? You think people care what you have to say? Something cracked in me. Maybe it was the years of silence. Maybe it was the way he said people as if I weren't one of them. As if my voice had no weight. Yes, I said. Just that one word. But it rang in the room like glass shattering. His eyes darkened. You're pushing me, Margaret, again. I'm not afraid of you anymore, I said. And that was a lie, but only half of one. The slap came fast. My head snapped to the side, the sting blooming across my cheek. But this time I didn't stumble, I didn't cry, I didn't apologize. I looked back at him, my eyes burning with something that wasn't fear. Not anymore. Don't look at me like that, he snapped. Don't act like you're better than me. I'm not better than you, I said, breathing hard. But I am done pretending you're better than me. He reached for me again, but this time I moved. My body reacted without thinking. Years of being his shadow had taught me how to read his movements before they finished forming. I grabbed the nearest thing on the kitchen counter, a ceramic mug, and threw it hard at the floor between us. It shattered, a loud, jagged explosion of sound that startled even him. You lay one more hand on me, and I swear to God I will press charges, I said. My voice was shaking, but not from fear. From rage. From 30 years of swallowed screams. He froze, hands still raised in the air, as if unsure whether I meant it. And I wasn't sure either, not entirely. But I saw something flicker in his eyes. Doubt. Hesitation. I took that moment and ran. I made it to the bedroom and locked the door, heart racing. My fingers dialed 911 before I could second-guess myself. I gave the dispatcher our address, my name, told her he'd hit me. Again, and for the first time, I didn't say it was an accident. I didn't try to soften the truth. The police arrived. In minutes, though it felt like a lifetime. I watched through the window as they spoke to him in the driveway, their flashlights cutting through the dark. He played his usual role, at first confused, concerned, betrayed. But when they saw the bruises forming on my cheek, when I handed them a folder I had secretly compiled over the past few months' photos, notes from my journal, a written statement, they stopped listening to him. They arrested him. He looked at me as they led him to the squad car, his eyes wide with disbelief. You'll regret this, he said, and I almost laughed at how predictable he'd become. The neighbors watched from their porches, eyes wide behind curtains. One woman clutched her robe at her chest as if trying to cover a wound of her own. Another looked away. Inside, the house felt quieter than it ever had. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was hollow, yes, but breathable. I stood in the kitchen, Broken mug still in pieces on the floor, my cheek pulsing with pain. I felt the weight of everything and nothing all at once. I felt wrecked. I felt triumphant. When the officer returned to take my full statement, I told him everything. Not just about that night, but about all the nights before. The ones buried under polite smiles and long sleeves. The ones no plaque or award would ever name. "Is there anyone we can call for you?" he asked. "Family? Friends?" I thought of Sarah, of Michael, of the woman who'd handed me a flyer in a paper bag, of Elena. I nodded. "Yes," I said. "I think I'm ready now." I thought the hardest part would be the night I called the police. It wasn't. The hardest part came afterward, when the reality of what I'd done settled around me, like smoke lingering, choking, inescapable. I sat in the living room that first morning after Robert's arrest, wrapped in a blanket I didn't remember getting, staring at the phone as it started to ring. I knew who it was before I answered. "Margaret," came the voice of Robert's lawyer, some smug man he'd coached debate with decades ago. "We'd prefer to handle this quietly. He's a pillar of this community. If you drop the charges, we can settle things amicably. No harm done. No harm?" I repeated, almost laughing. "Do broken ribs and bruises count as no harm?" He hesitated for a second too long, then cleared his throat. "Look, Margaret, you know how these things are perceived. Divorce court is one thing, but pressing criminal charges against a man like Robert, you'll lose more than you gain." I hung up. That was the beginning. Word spread quickly. Small towns are good at that. By the end of the week, the principal at Lincoln Elementary had placed Robert on leave pending investigation. The superintendent released a carefully worded statement. Something about respecting privacy, ensuring fairness, reserving judgment. I watched it on the local news, sitting in the same armchair where I'd once seen Robert's face celebrated during the community award ceremony. Now his picture flashed beside the phrase, "Longtime educator accused of domestic abuse." The first time I walked into the courtroom, I felt like I was on trial. Not Robert me. My hands trembled as I clutched my purse, the strap digging into my shoulder like penance. People in the gallery stared openly, some with concern, others with suspicion. A few I recognized, former faculty spouses, neighbors, parents whose children Robert had coached. None of them smiled. My attorney, a soft-spoken woman named Leah who had handled domestic violence cases before, tried to prepare me. "They're going to question everything," she said. "Your memory, your motives, your mental health. That's how these cases work." She wasn't wrong. Robert's defense painted him as a loving husband, a misunderstood man, the victim of a confused, unstable woman seeking attention. They submitted photos from school functions, letters from parents praising him, even old Christmas cards with cheerful handwritten notes. They tried to show that I was emotional, that I had a history of withdrawal from social events, that I suffered from long-term anxiety. The irony was cruel. The very symptoms of my survival were now being weaponized against me. But I didn't break. I took the stand. I told the truth, not just about the night of the final confrontation, but about the years that led to it. I described the bruises, the broken bones, the silence. I spoke about the isolation, the manipulation, the fear that seeped into every corner of my life. My voice cracked, but I did not cry. I had spent too many years crying alone. When it was over, Leah squeezed my hand. "You were brave," she whispered. I wasn't sure if that was true, but I was still standing, and that had to count for something. The hardest part came when Sarah and Michael were called to testify. I hadn't asked them to. The choice was theirs. I told them that I didn't want them reliving what I had tried and failed to shield them from. Sarah went first. She wore a blazer 2 sizes too big and kept her hands folded in her lap, like she was trying not to shake. Her voice was clear, steady. She spoke about the shouting, the way Robert used to throw things when he was angry, the way I flinched when someone touched my shoulder. She didn't say much about her own experience, but when the defense attorney asked if she thought her mother was overreacting, Sarah's jaw tightened. I saw my mother lie to a doctor about a broken rib. She said, I saw her put makeup over bruises and teach me how to smile even when I was scared. If you think she's overreacting, you weren't there. Michael followed. He was taller now, broader, but he still looked like that little boy hiding behind the couch during Robert's tantrums. His testimony was shorter, more clipped. He never hit me, he said, staring at the floor. But he didn't have to. We knew what would happen if we stepped out of line. Did your mother ever exaggerate? The defense lawyer asked. Did she ever lie? Michael looked up. She lied every day, he said, to protect us. From him, from you, from all of you who never asked what was really happening. That silence that followed was the loudest moment in the courtroom. The trial stretched on for weeks. Some days I walked out of the courthouse barely able to breathe. I'd come home and sit on the floor of my bedroom, staring at the place where Robert used to keep his shoes, as if expecting his shadow to rise from the carpet. Other days I felt a strange kind of power, like I was reclaiming ground I hadn't known was mine. The verdict came on a rainy Thursday in October. Robert was found guilty of domestic battery and aggravated assault, but the sentence was light 18 months in county jail, 5 years probation. He wouldn't serve even half of it. That was the law. That was the justice system. I should have been outraged. Maybe part of me was. But mostly, I felt hollow. Later that day, Leah walked me to my car. You changed the story, she said. You didn't let him write the ending. I nodded, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I didn't know what came next. I only knew what I was leaving behind. A house full of ghosts, a life built on silence, a name that no longer meant anything to me. That night, I sat at the kitchen table in a friend's guest room, flipping through my notebook. I turned to a fresh page and wrote one sentence, slow and steady. Today, the world heard my truth. And I'm still here. When Robert was sentenced, people didn't know what to say to me. Some didn't say anything at all. Others offered tight smiles, half-hearted nods in the grocery store, or the kind of polite avoidance reserved for the newly widowed, or the deeply shamed. It was a strange limbo to have survived something so public, so ugly, and yet feel erased in its aftermath. The verdict had made the papers, but not the front page. A small article near the bottom. Local educator sentenced in domestic violence case. No editorial. No retraction of the glowing tributes printed months earlier. No apology from the mayor who once called him a beacon of selfless service. Silence, again, but a different kind. Heavier. More suffocating in its indifference. Moved into a small duplex on the edge of town. It was old but clean, with creaky floors and wallpaper that peeled slightly at the corners. But it was mine. I paid rent with the help of a victims' compensation fund, supplemented by modest savings I'd managed to squirrel away over the years. $5 bills slipped between book pages, coins in forgotten jars. There was no grandeur in it, but it felt like the first space that hadn't been curated by Robert's preferences. I bought a yellow lamp for the bedroom, just because I liked the color. I'd put framed photos of Sarah and Michael on the windowsill. I kept the front door locked, but not because I was afraid, because I had chosen it that way. For weeks, I didn't leave much. I let the silence settle around me, trying to find comfort in it instead of fear. But eventually, the quiet started to change. Not the hollow kind I'd known for decades, the kind filled with tension and the careful choreography of survival, but something gentler. At first, I didn't recognize it. I mistook it for loneliness. But it wasn't that. It was space. Space. To think, to rest, to remember who I was before Robert carved pieces out of me with every insult, every slap, every accusation masked as concern. Then one morning, I walked past a community bulletin board near the library. A flyer for a local women's shelter fluttered in the breeze. They were looking for volunteers, someone to help sort clothing donations, serve meals, answer phones. I stared at the paper for a long time, remembering Jennifer, the nurse who slipped me that hotline card in the hospital, remembering Karen from the crisis line, and Elena from the support group, the women who held my story without judgment when I couldn't even hold it myself. Without them, I might never have made it out. Maybe it was time to become one of them. The shelter was small 3 bedrooms, a shared kitchen, a worn couch with threads coming loose at the seams. But it was full of life. Children laughing too loudly, women whispering in corners, someone always crying softly behind a closed door. On my first day, a young woman named Lena sat across from me at the intake desk. She was maybe 20. With a toddler on her hip and a fading bruise near her collarbone. "I'm not sure I belong here," she said, eyes darting to the door. I looked at her for a long moment. "That's what I said too," I told her. The first time someone tried to help me. Her eyes filled with tears. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. I reached across the table and placed a tissue in her hand, the same way someone had once done for me. The work wasn't easy. I heard stories that broke me open in places I thought had scarred over. But it also gave me something I hadn't felt in years: purpose. Not performance, not survival, but honest, human purpose. I wasn't just reliving pain, I was using it, turning it outward, softening it at the edges so someone else could carry it more easily. Outside the shelter, time passed. Sarah graduated college and moved to a nearby city. We talked more now. Not daily, but enough. She asked questions, sometimes quiet ones. "When did you know he'd never change? Why didn't you tell me it was that bad?" And the hardest one, "Did you stay because of us?" I didn't lie. I told her the truth as best I could. That I thought I was protecting them. That I thought love meant endurance. That I didn't know how to leave because I no longer remembered what freedom looked like. Michael took longer. He carried his hurt like armor. For a time I thought he might never speak to me again. But one day, out of nowhere, he showed up at my door with a bag of groceries and a stack of his childhood drawings. "I found these in Dad's garage," he said. "I thought you should have them." We sat at my table in silence, flipping through pages of lopsided stick figures and houses drawn in crayon. One picture showed a family of 4 standing in front of a smiling sun. Only 3 of the figures had faces. We didn't say much that afternoon, but he hugged me when he left. It was the first time he'd done that in years. The house Robert and I had shared was eventually sold. I didn't go back to collect anything. I didn't want the furniture or the silver or the boxes of photo albums where smiles hid bruises just out of frame. I wanted the blank page, the next chapter, a life that was mine alone. Some people in town still looked at me sideways in the post office or lowered their voices when I entered a room. A few said I ruined a good man's name, but others privately approached me with stories of their own. A woman from church who said her father was like Robert. A man who said he watched his mother endure what I had and wished she'd had the courage to leave. Not everyone believed me, but enough did. And I had finally learned that belief was never a prerequisite for truth. Robert was released early. Of course he was. He moved to another town, maybe across the state. I didn't care. He was no longer my concern. Whatever power he once had over me had crumbled the day I stood in court and said his name out loud, not as a husband, not as a teacher, not as a hero, but as the man who had broken me and the man I had survived. One evening, I returned to the support group I'd once sat in as a stranger. Elena was still there, her hair a little whiter now, her voice just as steady. She welcomed me with open arms and asked if I'd be willing to share my story with the group. I hesitated, not out of fear, but because I wanted to get it right. When I finally spoke, I began the way so many others had before me. "My name is Margaret," I said, my voice calm, "and I'm still learning how to live without fear." But I wasn't ashamed anymore. I was free. Healing doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with trumpets or declarations or a sudden lightness in your chest. For me, it began with small things. Waking up and not flinching at the sound of footsteps in the hallway above my unit. Pouring coffee without bracing for. Criticism about its temperature. Rearranging the furniture in my living room, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I bought a blue ceramic vase from the flea market, the kind Robert would have called tacky, and filled it with sunflowers. I didn't even like sunflowers, not really. But they were bright, bold. They took up space unapologetically. And that, I think, was the point. I started seeing a therapist named Alma, a woman in her 60s with silver curls, and a soft but unrelenting way of listening. At first, I didn't know what to say. I had already testified in court, already shared my story at the shelter. What else was there to say? That therapy wasn't about retelling the past. It was about learning to live with it. Alma asked questions I never dared ask myself. What did safety feel like in my body? When had I last experienced joy, not just relief? What parts of me still lived in that old house, in that old silence? The hardest part wasn't talking about Robert. It was talking about Margaret, the version of me who had learned to anticipate danger, to speak only when spoken to smile through pain. She had kept me alive, and for that I owed her everything. But she wasn't the woman I wanted to be anymore. Alma helped me understand that I didn't have to hate her. I could grieve her, thank her, and then let her go. My days filled with routines that once would have felt meaningless. Morning walks through the park, grocery trips without rushing, reading novels I chose for myself. I stopped asking permission out loud or in my own head. When a neighbor invited me to a potluck, I went. I brought lemon bars and wore a dress that made my arms look strong. One of the women complimented my hair, and I said thank you without deflecting or apologizing. After dinner, I sat on the porch swing with two other women who laughed too loudly and didn't care who heard. I listened, and then tentatively, cautiously I joined in. My laughter surprised me. It was rusty, unfamiliar. But real. Sarah and I grew closer, though our relationship was tender like new skin, soft, easy to bruise. She visited once a month, sometimes with a boyfriend, sometimes alone. We talked more honestly now, not as mother and daughter performing politeness, but as two women recovering from the same storm. She told me about therapy, about the patterns she saw in herself, about how long it took her to trust that love didn't have to come with fear. I listened. I didn't give advice. I didn't say I was sorry for the 1000th time. I let her speak. That, I learned, was love too. Michael took longer. He always did. His forgiveness was quieter, more measured, but no less present. One night, he called out of the blue, just to tell me he'd gotten a promotion at work. I thought you should know. he said. You used to care about things like that. I smiled at the implication. He knew I still cared. He just hadn't known how to believe it. On Sundays, I volunteered at the shelter library. We had a few battered shelves of donated books, most of them paperbacks with cracked spines. But to the children who curled up on the couch after dinner, they were treasures. I started reading aloud chapter books, fairy tales, stories where monsters were vanquished and the scared girl always made it home. The kids would gather around, some barely old enough to sit still, others with eyes that had already seen too much. One night, a little girl named Janelle reached up and touched the scar on my forearm. What happened? She asked without fear, only curiosity. I didn't lie. A very long time ago, I said. Someone hurt me. But I'm okay now. She considered this for a moment, then nodded. I think you're very strong. I didn't cry until after. She left the room. At Alma's suggestion, I began writing, not just in my journal, but with purpose. I wrote an article for the shelter's newsletter, then another for a women's health magazine. Then, at Sarah's gentle encouragement, I started drafting a memoir. It felt absurd at first. Who would want to read about an old woman's bruises, her regrets, her long road to a rented duplex and a kitchen full of hand-me-down dishes? But the more I wrote, the more I realized the story wasn't just about suffering. It was about survival. It was about reclamation. It was about what happens when a woman who has been silenced for decades finally decides to speak and keep speaking, even when her voice shakes. The town changed too, slowly, subtly. A new principal took over at Lincoln Elementary. The community service award was renamed after a social worker who had spent her life advocating for at-risk youth. I was invited quietly, discreetly to attend the ceremony. I stood at the back of the auditorium, anonymous in a sea of applause, and felt no bitterness. Just distance. Just release. Not everyone forgot Robert. Some still called what happened a misunderstanding. Some whispered when I walked by. But I no longer carried the burden of convincing them. Their belief was no longer a requirement for my healing. One spring morning, I walked through the park and watched as a group of girls played hopscotch on the pavement. Their laughter was sharp and bright. One of them slipped and fell, and her friend immediately helped her up, brushing dirt from her skirt. No judgment, no blame, just instinctive care. I felt something stir in my chest, tenderness, maybe, or hope. I sat on a nearby bench, closed my eyes, and let the sunlight fall across my face. I thought of the woman I used to be, the woman I had become, and the woman still unfolding, piece by piece, day by day. Healing wasn't a destination. It was 1,000 small choices. To stay, to speak, to keep breathing even when it hurt. And in that moment, I was grateful for all of them. I hadn't planned to write the letter. It began as a journal entry, just another private release, something for my own clarity. But the words came out different this time. They weren't for me. They were for the people who still walked past the plaque in the town hall, who still nodded reverently at the name etched in gold, who still remembered Robert Harrison as a hero. They were for the women who stayed quiet at PTA meetings, who covered bruises with cardigans and made excuses in hospital rooms. And they were for the girl I used to be, the one who couldn't imagine a life on the other side of silence. I typed the letter on my old laptop, the keys stiff with age. I signed my name at the bottom, not as Mrs. Robert Harrison, but as Margaret in full. Then I sealed it in an envelope, addressed it to the editor of the local paper, and walked it to the mailbox myself. My hands didn't tremble when I let it go. It was published 3 days later. A full column. They didn't edit it down. For years, my husband was called a pillar of the community. He coached children, taught school, and was honored with awards and public praise. What most people didn't see, what they chose not to see, was what happened behind closed doors. For 40 years, I endured physical, emotional, and psychological abuse from the man you once applauded. And for 40 years, I smiled through it because I thought I had to. Because I didn't believe anyone would believe me. The letter went on to describe my journey, how I survived, how I testified, how I healed. It didn't ask for pity. It asked for acknowledgement. It asked people to look more closely at the men they canonize and the women they forget. I didn't name names beyond my own. I didn't need to. The morning it ran, my phone rang non-stop. Calls, voicemails, emails from old acquaintances, from strangers. Some expressed shock, some offered apologies, some said nothing, just that they'd read it and that it meant something to them. One woman, a retired teacher who had worked with Robert. I should have seen it. I'm so sorry. I didn't need her guilt. But I appreciated her honesty. The letter did more than stir conversation. It shifted something. A local reporter asked to interview me for a piece about domestic violence in small towns. I agreed, with the condition that the focus stay on the issue, not on Robert. I didn't want to be a footnote to his story anymore. I wanted to be the author of my own. A month later, with the help of the shelter board, I launched a scholarship fund in my name for young women from abusive homes who were pursuing education. Sarah helped with the paperwork. Michael donated. Quietly. The first recipient was a high school senior named Kayla. She wore a dress with sleeves too long for the season, and didn't speak much when I handed her the certificate. But after the ceremony, she hugged me. Tight. Without words. That night, I sat on my porch with a cup of tea and watched the sun dip behind the trees. I thought about legacy, how easily it's rewritten, how often it's built on omissions. For so long, Robert's legacy had been the only one people saw. That now, side by side with his awards, there was a plaque in the shelter library with my name on it, in honor of Margaret Harrison, who turned survival into strength. Sarah came by the next day with her daughter, Ellie. At 4 years old, she was all energy and questions, already full of opinions about books and butterflies, and what color the sky really is when you squint hard enough. She asked about the scar on my arm while we were baking cookies. I looked at Sarah, unsure what to say, but Sarah nodded, gently, and I knelt beside Ellie and said, "That's part of my story. It reminds me how strong I am." Ellie blinked at me, then offered a confident nod, as if that made perfect sense. And maybe, to her, it did. As twilight settled in, Sarah sat beside me on the couch and took my hand. We didn't talk about the letter or the past or the ways we had both grown up in a house where silence had ruled. We just sat, present, unafraid. The scar on my arm has faded over the years. You have to look closely now to see it. But I still trace it sometimes, not with shame, but with remembrance. Not of what was done to me, but of what I lived through, of who I became in spite of it. Because of it, I am not the woman people thought I was. I am not just the widow of a decorated teacher. I am not just the woman who stayed too long. I am a survivor. I am a mother. I am a grandmother who bakes cookies and keeps her front door open when it's sunny. I am a woman who told the truth, and then told it again, and then built something out of the telling. I don't know how much time I have left. None of us do, but I know what I've done with mine since reclaiming it. I've lived, I've healed, and I've made sure that my story, my real story, will outlive the lies that tried to bury it. That, I think, is legacy enough.